Okay, thanks very much, comrades. Welcome to Marxism. I'd like to tell you that this is going to be a meeting full of cheer and entertainment, but actually the Anthropocene isn't really like that. We are, I suppose, lucky to be having this meeting in the midst of such a balmy heat wave. We are currently living through one of the hottest periods in recorded history, and while we might enjoy this as a rather pleasant, sunny summer, for large parts of the world, this is extreme weather. Montreal, beginning of July, highest temperature in recorded history, 36.6 degrees. Scotland, highest temperature, 33.2, ever on record in Motherwell, earlier at the last year. That should say June the 28th. July the 2nd in Armenia, 42 degrees Celsius. Kiryat, Oman, a little fishing village on the coast, the world's hottest minimum temperature ever recorded, 42.6 degrees. The minimum temperature means that the 24-hour period of that day, it never dropped below 42. So for much of the day, it was hotter. Imagine working, living in those conditions. Pakistan, highest temperature ever recorded, 50.2 degrees Celsius. And just to show that climate denial, America isn't free of this, Denver had 40.5 degrees Celsius at the beginning of this, at the end of last month. So look, this is the context really of this discussion. It's an important discussion. I'm glad we're opening Marxism in a sense with this crucial discussion. How do revolutionaries and socialists operate in an era of unprecedented climate change, unprecedented environmental disaster, biodiversity crises, and so on? And in the it's almost exactly a year since Donald Trump pulled the United States out of the hitherto best agreement on climate change, the agreement made in Paris in 2015, COP21, and we are 5 months ahead of the next round of talks taking place, which the Americans will not be part of. Those will take part in Poland. And already there's concern amongst senior negotiators that those talks are behind schedule and will be inadequate. At the end of the last round of talks, so in December last year, Alden Mayer, who's the director of the Union of Concerned Scientists, said that diplomats acknowledge they're behind schedule. We haven't seen a single country saying they're not going to try to meet the commitments they made in Paris. Of course, the proof will come in a couple of years down the road when it comes time for countries to finally put forward their longer-term targets. So the real question is, will countries do more? Comrades who were active or involved in the environmental movement around the time of Paris will remember the jubilation that was greeted by the negotiators and the politicians in Paris when they finally signed that agreement. Enormous and unprecedented celebrations, if you like, that an agreement had been made which was, it was argued, deal with the unprecedented climate crisis. In fact, the reality was very, very different, as commentators very quickly pointed out. Even if countries were to stick to their pledges, and they were voluntary pledges, there was no legally blinding commitment on any country to meet those targets, temperatures would still exceed a 2 degrees rise above the pre-industrial average. And in fact, you'll have noticed in that quote I read out, the decisions about exactly how much, when and where were actually postponed to a further conference in 2020. And the reality is despite the scenes of celebration here, the world is moving too slowly towards any form of international agreement. The international agreements that have been made are voluntary and inadequate, and crucially they are based on an assumption that the free market will deliver the change that is needed. Which is why I'm going to move on from the celebration figures, and I'm going to leave up a picture of the enormous protest that took place outside Paris at the time. Real celebratory, mass movements, insurrectionary atmosphere in Paris, as millions of ordinary people around the globe and in that city said, actually, we want something far, far better. And I would argue that it was the scale of these protests and the pressure ahead of the Paris Agreement in December 2015 that meant that the agreement that was signed was as good as it was, despite its enormous limitations. And since Paris, really things have only got worse on the climate front. There was a report from a series of scientists that was summarised in New Scientist a couple of weeks ago, which discussed not the expected behaviour but the worst case scenarios. And they said that the problem is that all the worst case scenarios that have been made by organisations like the IPCC and so on are actually inadequate, that the worst case scenarios are now much, much worse than anyone had ever expected. And you would expect, you'd think, given the scenes of celebration, given the growing threat from climate change, that politicians would actually have done something. And then the reality is the opposite is true. In Britain, the amount of emissions, carbon dioxide emissions, have actually dropped quite substantially by 43% compared to the 1990 figures. But that's because of an increased use of renewable energy, and in particular a drop in the use of coal to produce energy in the UK. That's actually a commitment that's being undermined systematically by our current government, and it wasn't based on the fact that the current Tory government is arguing and pushing for both an expansion of Heathrow Airport, for an expansion of the road system, and an expansion of the fossil fuel industries, and particularly fracking. It's a shock and it's a shame that, for instance, that the Tory government has pushed through the expansion of Heathrow Airport. It's even more shaming that 100 Labour MPs supported that, and I think we should be absolutely clear that that's a disgraceful retreat from them. From their policies. It's also interesting that the government is backing off on all sorts of other things. The Swansea tidal lagoon a couple of weeks ago, and so on. And of course, despite their green rhetoric, they're pushing forward on fracking and so on. And you may hear lots of green gloss over things like the phasing out of coal power stations. Well, the Drax, the biggest coal power station in the country, has been converted to biofuel energy. So that will have still have a massive impact on the environment. And wider afield, the situation is still worse. At Paris, the European Union group of countries committed to reducing its emissions by 35% by 2030. Great, good figure. The reality is that last year European Union emissions rose by 1.8%. And so in this context, the debate about what we do as revolutionaries, what we argue, and how the wider movement should respond to this environmental crisis, I think is crucially important. And I think that what we have to be honest about is that what is needed is drastic, radical action. We need the state-led shutdown of fossil fuel industries. We need a complete ban on the expansion of airports, no more road expansion. We need to stop the introduction of fossil fuel industries like fracking and so on. We need, in those industries, a just transition to climate jobs, to renewable and low energy alternatives. And we need a radical transformation of every aspect of our economies and our lives, from the design of cities to our public transport to agriculture and so on. And that sort of strategy, I think, has to be central to anyone who considers themselves a progressive, on the left, an environmental activist. That has to be our ambition, really. It's no longer enough to talk about simply how much recycling we're doing, how much we are doing as individuals. It's no longer to have that enough to have those as your strategies. I think we have to have a strategy of forcing governments and states to lead those sort of changes. And we are in an emergency situation. Andreas Malm, a very good Marxist writer from Scandinavia, who's written a number of books, a couple of them are on sale there at the end, he, in a recent article, quoted Lenin, writing at the time of the outbreak of the First World War. And Lenin said about that war that it would end up engendering worldwide crises of unparalleled intensity, ultimately bringing whole nations to the brink of doom. It could have been something written about the climate catastrophe that we face. Now, the title of this talk uses the word Anthropocene. It's a very useful concept, I think, for this discussion, because it's a reflection, really, that scientists are aware of both the enormous scale of the changes that are taking place, and also are aware that this is a change that has to be located amongst wider human society and its relationship to the environment. The term is used to define the epoch of history that we're now part of, one where human activity is the dominant factor on world systems, on the environment, on climate, on the atmosphere, and so on. A pronounced, to use the official description, a pronounced and relatively sharp threshold in the human modification of the global environment. There are all sorts of debates that take place. You can read the books and the articles and so on about when the Anthropocene should be dated from, whether it should be dated from the dawn of human civilization, when humans first started to change the environment around them, whether it should begin at the Industrial Revolution, when we first started systematically burning fossil fuels and so on. I tend to agree with those scientists and political activists who argue that we should probably date it from the post-Second World War period, when there was an enormous acceleration, a great acceleration in our ability to both produce commodities and transform the environment as we did so. Here's a description from three of the key scientists involved in this work. Over the past 50 years, humans have changed the world's ecosystems more rapidly and extensively than in any other comparable period in human history. The Earth is in its sixth great extinction event, with rates of species loss growing rapidly for both terrestrial and marine ecosystems. The atmospheric concentrations of several important greenhouse gases have increased substantially, and the Earth is warming rapidly. More nitrogen is now converted from the atmosphere into reactive forms by fertilizer production and fossil fuel combustion than by all of the natural processes in terrestrial ecosystems put together. It's a fundamental transformation in how the world's systems work, and at the heart of it is our civilization, our society, and how it interacts with the natural world. Which brings us on to a crucial question, which is, can that system, capitalism, can it be sustainable? I have argued at a great length previously that is not true. It's not possible for capitalism to be a sustainable system. As with all historical human societies, capitalism is based on an interaction between human society and nature. And each different type of human society, whether it's been feudal societies, whether it's been hunter-gatherer communities, they have had a different relationship with the natural world, a different way of interacting, shaping and changing the natural world, but they all have changed that natural world as they have existed. Capitalism transforms that relationship into new forms. And at the heart of that, and heart of the reason for that, is that capitalism is based not on any attempt to satisfy human need, but on the drive by the capitalists to make profits, to accumulate wealth for the sake of accumulation. And that means the systematic degradation, the systematic usage of natural resources for both the productive process and from the waste of those productive processes. Nature becomes purely a source of raw materials or a destination for waste. And if you think of all the environmental crises that we face, climate change, biodiversity loss and so on, at their roots they're all about how capitalism either strips natural resources out or aspects of ecosystems out of those systems, uses them up and then dumps the waste from that process into the atmosphere, into the seas and so on. And because under capitalism production is not planned, it's irrational, it's based on competition, that usage of natural resources, that destruction is ongoing and is not limited. And secondly, and another aspect of this, is that capitalism itself is based on the use of fossil fuels, and fossil fuels are an absolute integral part of how capitalism organises itself and how production takes place. Capitalism begins not actually using fossil fuels but other forms of energy, human labour power, wind, water and so on. And at a specific point, particularly in England, it takes up the use of fossil fuels systematically. Firstly for steam engines and coal, and then oil and natural gas later on in capitalism. The capitalists do that for a number of reasons, partly because they can have more ready access to energy, they don't have to find places to locate water wheels and so on, but crucially because they can use fossil fuels anywhere in the country, and that gives them access to large numbers of working people in the cities who can then be sucked in as part of the production process. And once that takes place, once a few capitalists start to use fossil fuels and in the cities, all the other capitalists have to follow them suit, otherwise they're left behind. And that takes place in England very rapidly, and as capitalism spreads around the globe, it spreads as a fossil fuel system. And if we fast forward to today, fossil fuels then are absolutely integral to how capitalism works, how profits are made, and to the biggest and largest fossil fuel organisations. Just as an example of this, here is a very recently launched vehicle. This is the Prelude floating natural gas platform. It's the largest floating structure ever built by humans. It's owned by Shell, and it costs Shell a staggering $14 billion. It aims to pump, over the next 25 years, which is its expected lifetimes, 5.3 million tonnes of fossil fuel gas per annum. Now, it doesn't matter how many scientists say that we don't have to stop burning fossil fuels, how many environmental activists sign petitions saying to Shell, will you please stop? Shell's corporate board is not going to turn around and go, it's a fair cop, we're going to stop using this boat, we're going to let the historic investment go, we're going to say goodbye to our $14 billion. And at the root of it, that's the problem with challenging fossil fuel corporations. Now, this is an extreme example. There are, of course, other extreme examples, and there are also a microcosm of dozens and dozens of organisations that have investments in the fossil fuel systems, in pipelines, in engines, in petroleum manufacturing, all sorts of things that they don't want to give up, because if capitalism works in any way, it's based upon a return upon the wealth that you've historically invested in the infrastructure. And if we want to stop Shell, if we want to stop their extreme energy, we're going to have to force them. We're going to have to break those companies up. We're going to have to stop them operating and organising. Now, capitalism is unsustainable. That's not to say it isn't reformable. And I think we have to be very careful as revolutionary socialists that we don't somehow offer a pie-in-the-sky dream where we say to people, we can't, that we have to wait for some future revolution. We have to be aware that reforms can be really, really important in the fight for environmental change today. You can, as states, if you operate, you can stop pollutions, you can ban certain activities, you can stop the building of runways and the expansion of airports, you can ban chemicals, you can introduce recycling programs and so on, and states can do that in the here and now. But we also have to understand that even if those reforms do take place, there's a constant pressure to undermine them, to change them, to drag them backwards, or to resist them. And organisations like Shell will resist as they can any attempt to curtail their profits or to limit their activities. And that, I think, is why, at the heart of the current US administration, there is a climate denial aspect to their behaviour. That said, even if we do get lots and lots of reforms, capitalism remains that unsustainable system. Marx writes in Capital at great length about capitalist farming and how it is an unsustainable way of getting food out of the ground and feeding populations and clothing people and so on. He writes that all progress in capitalist agriculture is progress in the art, not only of robbing the worker, but of robbing the soil. All progress in increasing the fertility of the soil for a given time is progress towards ruining the more lasting sources of that fertility. He gives a sense of the constant undermining of the natural basis of our society. So, having mentioned Marx, what do we learn from Marx for the purposes of this talk? And I'd argue that there's two crucial elements here. Firstly, the whole basis of Marx's theory of human history and progress and change and how societies function and so on, historical materialism, is a sense that human societies exist on the basis of an interaction, a metabolism, he calls it, between humans and nature. Humans are part of nature, he argues, but we're also in a constantly shifting interactive relationship with the natural world. It's one that changes nature and it changes us as well. And under capitalism, Marx writes, that interaction, that metabolic relationship experiences a rift, a growing break between human society and the natural world. Marx says that capitalism produces conditions that provoke an irreparable rift in the interdependent process of social metabolism, a metabolism described by the natural laws of life itself. And when he's writing about agriculture, he continues, the squandering of the vitality of the soil, which is carried by trade far beyond the bounds of a single country, is an example of this. That the fact that the idea that it's profitable for capitalism to grow food somewhere and suck nutrients out of the soil systematically, take the food elsewhere where it's consumed, and then the waste of that, containing all those nutrients, is dumped in the sea and forgotten, and you're left with an area of farmland that is devoid of nutrients and so on. So that's one crucial aspect of Marxism for the basis of this talk. The second thing I think I wanted to highlight is that what Marx also identifies is a revolutionary force with the potential of transforming society and creating a socialist world that can heal that metabolic rift. And other meetings at Marxism will explore the power of the working class as an instrument for revolutionary change. But in short, I would argue it's because for the system to function, workers are absolutely crucial for the creation of the surplus value that capitalists make their profits from. And without those workers, that system cannot function. Also, secondly, because in the process of revolutionary transformation of society, workers also undergo a transformation of themselves. They throw off the muck of ages, the old reactionary ideas of racism, sexism, homophobia, and so on, and they also create a new collective consciousness, and I think that will be crucial for a future sustainable world. Capitalism alienates us from nature. Capitalism changes how we see it in terms of commodities and so on. So what do we need to do? And the first thing we need to do is to check how much time we have left, because we've got plenty of time apparently. I can talk for a long time. It's easy to come up with emergency things. I came up with a few earlier in the talk. Emergency strategies to deal with climate change. And these might include, for instance, a rapid switch from fossil fuel to renewable energy. We're imagining here we've got no limits of money or social power in society. The development of public transport infrastructure, the renationalisation of the railways, and crucially it's very topical at the moment for Jeremy Corbyn, the renationalisation and the end of the deregulation of buses, which I'm fully in favour of. The mass state insulation schemes to reduce energy usage from our houses, our homes, our factories, our workplaces and so on. An end to the building of fossil fuel infrastructure, a ban on fracking, an end to pipeline building and all these things that would help fuel the fossil fuel companies. In terms of agriculture, direct subsidies to farmers and farming communities, not to landowners, to reduce energy use and pesticides and chemical usage on farms and so on. And there are easy things to come up with, and actually they probably wouldn't cost very much in the great scheme of things. The renationalisation of the railways, the pumping of money into them wouldn't actually cost much in terms of the $14 billion that floating platform cost. But all of those things are direct challenges to fossil capitalism. All of those 5 examples I gave you would be a challenge to one or other aspect of a fossil fuel capitalist and a fossil fuel system. And they would resist it and they would fight it. And even if we were lucky enough to win a government that was prepared to introduce those sort of reforms, we would still have to create movements behind that government to help force through those changes, to force through a ban on fracking. You can imagine how the oil companies would immediately resort to the courts and say, oh, you're limiting what we can do and how we can make our profits and so on. We would have to help fight those through. And we know that because we have seen at every point in history capitalists resisting any changes that have an impact upon their profits in the interest of the environment. For instance, the main company in the 1950s, 1960s and 70s that manufactured CFC gases, the gases that were responsible for the destruction of the ozone layer around the world, a process that if it carried on would have led to enormous spikes in skin cancer and all sorts of other problems around the world. DuPont constantly refused to acknowledge that CFCs were responsible, despite overwhelming evidence. They funded all sorts of think tanks to argue the opposite was true. They gave all sorts of barriers to the introduction of legislation that would allow them to that would have banned CFC usage. Why? Because it would have impacted their profits dramatically. Interestingly, DuPont eventually did acknowledge that CFC gases were a problem and switched to new forms of gases. They did it for 2 reasons. Firstly, they recognised that they get huge subsidies from various companies from various countries to make that transformation. And secondly, because according to their official reports, it would give them a significant competitive advantage through the sales of a new chemical substitute. They saw a switch to a more environmentally benign gas as an opportunity to make money and get themselves ahead of all the other competitions, not because because they were kind or cared about people who might get skin cancer, because they only cared about the bottom dollar. And that's absolutely true of fossil fuel corporations. It's why fossil fuel corporations, since before most people or most scientists were aware of global warming as a problem, have already started funding climate denial and blurring the science and arguing and creating misinformation and distinction. And I think today we still live with a legacy of those. Now, I mentioned mass movements, and I think in this context, mass movements are absolutely crucial. I think, as I said earlier, that without mass movements, the international legislation that we've already got would be far, far weaker and far, far more limited. But we also know that mass protests and mass demonstration in recent history has made real changes to environmental aspects. Who can forget the scenes, for instance, at Standing Rock when they were trying to build that Dakota Access Pipeline through that Native American land? Who can forget the scenes of mass demonstrations where Native American activists and indigenous campaigners came together with environmental campaigners, and then the veterans of the US Marine Corps, rather unbelievably, came all together and forced Obama in the dying days of his administration to stop that pipeline. Now, of course, that's not to say it's permanently, Donald Trump would love to build some more pipelines, but the fact is those mass movements made a real difference to that. And we, on a smaller scale, but nonetheless still very important, in Britain, I think the constant campaigning and protest around the question of fracking, I think the constant presence of Pampers outside the fracking sites, and the solidarity from the wider movement, the trade unions, the environmentalists, the socialists, and so on, has meant that they still haven't been able to frack as much as they would like, as far as they would like. In Naomi Klein's book, This Changes Everything, she describes these movements as blockadia, a sense of growing mass movements, blocking and preventing governments and fossil fuel corporations doing what they would like to do. In that context, though, we also have to be aware of another aspect to this question, which is the way that climate change and environmental crises will also have impacts into human society that can then provoke further responses both from ordinary people and from governments. Climate change will cause huge crises for capitalism. The scale of environmental crisis will lead to famine, to more natural disasters, flooding, hurricanes, food shortages, and all sorts of other problems. We see that already around the world, and we've seen it historically with things like Katrina and so on. But we will know that as climate change gets worse, as environmental crisis grows, those will take place more often and more frequently. Andreas Malm, who I've already quoted, he says it like this, that any climatic spark will always burn through relations between people on its way to an explosion. That's precisely because climate change is closely associated with the very nature of human society. And as climate change worsens, as environmental disaster increases, it will speed up the contradictions of capitalism. And that can, and it's important that I say can, encourage resistance and mass movements. We saw in the early years of the 2000s a series of food riots taking place. The food prices shot through the roof in 2006, 2007 for a number of reasons. Climate change is one of them, the use of biofuels is another, mostly because of the speculation on the behalf of food companies and corporations to try and get as much profits as they could. The response in some parts of the world was mass riots. In Mexico, the Tortilla riots of 2007, where tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people converge on the big cities to protest over the government inaction on keeping food prices down. It was the question of food and access to food was a part of the run-up to the Arab Spring, particularly in Egypt and so on. And in Syria, while some argue that the Syrian revolution was caused by climate change, I don't think that's true, but climate change and the way it displaced populations within Syria helped increase social tensions and political tensions inside that country that fueled the rise of the Syrian revolution and then the counter revolution to this. What I'm trying to say is that the effects of climate change can provoke movements that can then become revolutionary. It's not automatic, and it isn't definitely going to happen. I don't want anyone to go away and say, Martin Empson says that there'll be a revolution because climate change will make people's lives worse. That's not what I'm saying at all. Wars can lead to revolution, but they can also lead to the dispiriting of the working class. Sometimes, though, there will be mass movements that rise out because people want to do something over climate change. I mentioned a few of them, the Paris demonstrations that many people in this room were part of. Previously, the wave that people might remember in 2004, I think it was, when large numbers of people demonstrated ahead of the Copenhagen conference. And now I haven't got enough time. And I think so. You can imagine that people responding to climate change or anticipating climate change and other environmental disasters will also provoke social movements. In Manchester, near where I live, in Salford, repeatedly houses are starting to get flooded, and people are starting to demand of the council, why does this keep happening? Why is the floodgates inadequate? Why are the barriers not enough? And you can imagine social movements arising as people want to protect themselves and so on. And as revolutionaries, we would like to constantly see those movements as developing. We must remember, for instance, that the Russian Revolution did not start in February of 1917 with millions of people suddenly saying, right, we want an end to capitalism, an end to war, an end to poverty and so on. It started because people protested over food prices, women, and that process develops over a year through 1917, together with the conscious intervention of revolutionaries and the Bolshevik organisation to turn that revolution by October into a revolution against the system. And so what should socialists do? And I think there's some very clear things that we should do. Firstly, wherever those movements develop, or wherever there's a potential for those movements, we should throw ourselves into building campaigns. Here in the UK, for instance, socialists have been and are central to climate change campaigns. The mobilisations around Paris, against fracking in the northwest and the northeast of the country, protests for better climate legislation, and I imagine as we come towards the conference in Poland at the end of this year, there will be mobilisations, demonstrations taking place around that. And we are also very keen, and hopefully you've had a leaflet, to encourage people to demonstrate against Donald Trump when he comes, and to join, if you want to, the climate blocks that the Campaign Against Climate Change and other people are organising. I also think we want to try and shape those mass movements. Now, I don't say that means that we're going to go to those movements and say you all have to behave like the SWP says no. But what we want to do is to argue that those mass movements try and involve the maximum number of people, that they build mass demonstrations, that we don't focus on individual activity or a few hardy, brave souls who can camp out day and night at a fracking base. We want to try and find how we can develop and involve millions of people potentially in those movements. In Manchester, where I was part of a fracking campaign at Barton Moss, we actually started off with a little camp outside that and small protests. Then we called solidarity actions from the trade unions, culminating in a big anti-fracking demonstration in the heart of the city. We also, in the SWP, have been proud of the work that we've done to help build the 1 Million Climate Jobs campaign that has been an attempt to get mass working class involvement and trade union involvement in environmental issues, to take climate change and environment into the workplace. But we constantly have to link the capitalist crisis to climate change and vice versa. And we also have to say, though, that if we want to deal with climate change, it's not enough simply to campaign on climate change and on the question of climate. We have to take all the other social aspects that take place and build around those two. So we constantly have to show the link between climate and capitalism. And here I think there's an interesting analogy with the 1950s, when the threat of nuclear war meant that tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, sometimes millions of people started to recognise that there was a real possibility of a nuclear war. And for some people, that actually meant that they started to question, and the origins of our organisation have links to this, the way that capitalism could possibly consider annihilating the whole of the human race in the interests of its competitive nature. And so for a minority of people in the anti-nuclear war campaign, they started to draw revolutionary conclusions. And I think that's also true of the climate crisis and the environment. It can lead to the growth of people questioning capitalism, growth of anti-capitalist ideas, but also the growth of revolutionary organisations. But only if socialists are part of that. And finally, we have to link and build the links between climate change and other movements. The refugee crisis that will be exacerbated as people flee drought and famine and so on will lead to questions of racism, and we have to make sure that we're integrating anti-racism into that heart of that work. Because climate change will not automatically build the left One of the interesting things about the rise of the far right and fascism across Europe is, what do they offer? They offer stability. The world has gone mad. There's all these political crises. We can offer you stability, and we have to stop the migrants, and we have to put the barbed wire and build the fences and so on. And so as part of fighting climate change, you also have to fight the far right and so on. And here, of course, is the final, and I'll finish on this point. Here, of course, is the final question for revolutionaries, because if you're part of a revolutionary organisation, a socialist organisation, you do constantly have to prioritise. We all do it. Are we going to do a ring around about Marxism, or are we going to do a ring around about this demonstration? We've constantly got to think, how do we operate and what do we prioritise? And all of us have got different things that we have to campaign around: anti-racism, housing question, climate change, trade unionism, pay rates, and all those sort of things. And so we have to, at different times, prioritise different things. But I think what the revolutionary left has to do, and what the SWP I think has done quite successfully, is to recognise that climate change is both a key aspect of that work, but one that we have to integrate into all the other campaigns that we are part of. And at times we will have to also turn the organisation and turn the revolution towards building mass movements around these questions. At the time of Paris we did that, and I think we will do that when the next set of demonstrations come up at the Poland COP24 conference. Ultimately, though, we can only do that successfully if we've got a strong, confident, well-rooted organisation, which means that the left has to be bigger and that the revolutionary left has to be bigger, and in particular the SWP has to be bigger. And so do consider joining us, or at least working with us in all those different campaigns. The final thing, though, is there is an urgency. We want system change, not climate change, because if we don't have that change soon, millions of people are going to suffer from war, from famine, from drought, from hunger, from high temperatures, and all sorts of environmental crisis. The time really is to fight for it now, and that we need to be part of absolutely building those movements.
Yeah, the question I wanted to raise was the question of the recent vote in Parliament to expand Heathrow Airport. The media made a lot of a brouhaha about this because the Labour policy was to oppose expansion, and only 100 Labour MPs voted with with Corbyn and MacDonald to oppose it. And a lot of people say, well, this shows the Labour MPs are. I mean, it was a massive. I have to say, this is a massive setback. This is a huge defeat. If Heathrow gets built, this is the largest source of CO2 emissions in the country. It will be going up by 50%, and it's a battle we can't afford to lose in the climate justice. I mean, we should have to say this is a defeat and a setback. We have to fight it. But to me, what was really bad was the intervention of, Ken McCluskey, who was very good on other issues. When we talk about fighting fascism, excellent. But on the question of climate change, it's a very poor decision he made. He intervened wrote to the Labour MPs to say, you must back expansion because we need the jobs. And the point we have to say is, we are not going to have a habitable planet if we continue this way. And it's absolutely essential that we put the argument in the trade union movement against expansion and argue for alternatives such as climate jobs. 2 years ago, I was involved in drafting a motion which was put to the TUC on the question of climate change. We didn't get it through because some of the unions were opposed to including talk about reducing aviation emissions. Unions like the GNB and BALPA, all connected with the airline industries. And we have to win this fight because, the thing about climate change, it's true it will lead to more social protests. It can become an objective factor in a revolution, but it could become an objective factor in a negative way. When people talk about the Russian Revolution, not many people talk about the Spanish influenza. But the consequences of that for the Russian Revolution was absolutely catastrophic. And it's not, it's something we sort of parcel out as if it's not actually part of history. It's just a technical detail. But it decimated the Russian working class. It made it more difficult for the revolution to succeed. It meant that the revolutions had to resort to more repressive measures to hold the thing together. So we have to be clear about that.
Thanks for that great talk, Martin. I'm from Canada and wanted to talk about some of the similarities around the climate justice movements between Canada and here. And they are tricky campaigns. Often they're reactive, let's say to building of a pipeline or expansion of something. It's not like taking on a reform that you keep fighting for in a kind of a controlled, systematic way. And in Canada, the fights are against the tar sands, of course, which is the filthiest form of fossil fuels. And we have a big battle shaping up on the west coast of Canada, where the federal government has now proposed to bail out a Texas corporation who are going to build a massive pipeline from the tar sands in Alberta to the west coast. And that struggle is being led by Indigenous people. And if the government goes ahead with construction, you can be darn sure you'll have the next Standing Rock happening in Vancouver on the west coast. In Canada, the campaign movement relies on the leadership of Indigenous activists and also features what last comrade was talking about, just transitions for fossil fuel workers. The problem with that particular campaign around just transitions is that the Labour leadership is in the doldrums, so they're not really driving hard on that, demanding that the government provide apprenticeship programs, retooling, etc. But there's other ways of looking at this just transitions. In the province that I live in Ontario, we've had a very successful campaign called Fight for 15 and Fairness, and that was for the $15 minimum wage and a number of really, really positive reforms in the workplace. And a few months ago, we began a climate caucus. Because we can't wait for the Labour leadership to move ahead on the just transitions for fossil fuel sector workers. So we've taken a cue from Naomi Klein, who in her book, This Changes Everything, talks about caring jobs, our climate jobs, and the jobs that we need more of, personal care home workers, I'm not sure what they're called here, children's daycare centers. We need more of those jobs, and they need to be better paying. And if they were, that's another avenue for workers. So we're very new. We had the Rally for Decent Work after the election of a very right-wing premier in Ontario. It was called one of our banners was Raise Wages, Not the Seas. We're also thinking of doing education because some of the members of the Climate Caucus are migrant farm workers, and they have been displaced by hurricanes. One guy was from St. Lucia. So he's come to Canada as a migrant worker where they're a very exploited part of the workforce. They've, in fact, been exempted from these new workplace improvements, and tie that together with food security and climate justice. So there's different ways of tackling this issue in a very, what can be a tricky environment. So I just wanted to give that information as something for people to think about. If you're not getting much progress with the trade union movement, you want to keep that pressure up, but there's other ways of addressing the issue. And I'd like to ask Martin or anyone to talk about climate geoengineering.
Accidentally, I too am from Canada, and I wanted to follow up on what Valerie was just saying, because one of the big challenges I think around how we conceptualize just transition is not just for those workers in those industries that obviously need access to training and better jobs, but in order to make to increase the choices available to workers, we have to be able to make other jobs as attractive, the low carbon jobs as attractive as the oil extraction jobs, and we know those jobs were not always good jobs insofar as being paid well and so forth. It took unionization to make them good jobs. And in the Fight for 15 and Fairness, where it's a union of non-union and unionized workers, the unionized hotel workers in the hospitality sector can earn wages on par with oil extraction workers. That is a profoundly radical thing if we begin to think about what would it mean to raise wages in the service sector that is characterized by low wages, and also, and certainly in Canada, characterized by the precarious sector generally within which workers of color and newcomers and women are overrepresented in those sectors. So how can we actually fight to make all jobs better and increase workers' agency in the workplace where they're going to be better situated to take on the climate challenge, to take on all of these other things? And so fighting for unionization, fighting for more rights in the workshop or in the workplace is also a climate justice solution in its own right.
Hi, just a quick question really about the sort of Anthropocene stuff in relation to what I've heard people like Donna Haraway talk about as the Capitalocene, because obviously the Anthropocene implies humanity has a sort of inherent relationship in its species being to a change in the environment as we see it. But obviously, as you talked about, humanity hasn't always existed with these kind of means and relations of production. So I think at times maybe talking about in terms of the capitalist scene is more clear, and talking about the way that capitalism specifically and its constant infatuation with fossil fuels is something that has inherently changed the environment. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to try and explode two myths. One which was gently alluded to by Martin himself, whom I'd like to correct for a lack of emphasis rather than factual incorrection. And what Martin said was that coal is potentially worse than burning the biomass when he was referring to Drax Power Station. The scientific consensus last year, 1,500 scientists wrote to the US government with the scientific evidence that burning trees, burning biomass is more harmful than coal. So I would say that what Martin should have said is that potentially more harmful rather than potentially as harmful. Late last year, 800 scientists wrote to the European Union. The European Union supports biomass for the generation of electricity. That's burning trees and any other form of organic matter, and also very much has been supporting transport biofuels, which is causing huge destruction in Asia through palm oil deforestation. Now, I've been at many conferences, etc., over the last couple of years, where it has been argued from the floor that the solution to fracking is biomass, and some people argue that there are more trees being planted today than ever before. That's another myth I'd just like to correct. It really depends on what tree and what conditions they're being planted in. There may well be more saplings being planted than trees that are being felled at mature age. But under the UN RED system, which is reduced emissions from deforestation and degradation, RED plus, because RED was a disaster and they added a plus and they refined it. Now, under that definition, a tree is a plant that grows higher than 1 metre tall, which can, that's a shrub. And it also means that commercial plantations can be classified as forest. So when people say more trees are being planted than are being burned, I find that hard to believe for a start. But what are they talking about when they refer to a tree? Now, finally, I'd just like to say that it takes a minimum of 20 years to grow a tree to a usable purpose for burning for energy. Although there are GM trees being grown all around the world at the moment, and particularly in Brazil. And when the forest fires hit the Amazon last year, they came within a few hundred miles of a GM plantation, a plantation of trees that are being grown for their thermic efficiency. So had the fire reached that, Brazilian scientists say we have no idea what the consequences, explosive consequences, would have been. But anyway, the point I'd like to make is this, that you plant a tree and it takes 20 to 30 years to get to replace the tree that you've just burned with carbon storage. We don't have 20 or 30 years. The forest fires that are raging across the world on every continent except Antarctica will actually destroy those. If we continue the way we're going, they will not reach maturity because of global warming. Thank you.
I'd just like to ask Martin two questions. The first one has been referred to by some of the previous speakers, which is the question of involving the workers who work in fossil industries. I mean, we did have, 30 odd years ago, the big battle to defend the jobs of the mine workers. Now, if we were to kind of transplant that time to today, how would we be persuading mine workers? How would we be getting them into a class struggle against fossil capitalism, as I think Martin referred to it as? One speaker referred to the attitude of Len McCluskey and how, in fact, he has influenced the Labour Party, both on Heathrow, as was mentioned, but also on Trident, because he's defending his workers' jobs. That is a sort of limitation, if you like, in that sense of a non-revolutionary trade union attitude. And then another speaker said, well, raising wages in other sectors, like the hospitality sector, will, sort of help to bring all workers together. I think that's true up to a point. I don't think it really totally solves the problem. So, how we approach mine workers, oil extraction workers, and so on, and bring them into this struggle. The second question that I'd like to ask Martin is, could you say more about how a future socialist or communist society would ensure that it is sustainable?
Yeah, I just wanted to come back to the question about the Anthropocene. Someone asked about it. I'm sure Martin will come back on it, but I really understand it as the fact we live in an epoch where the world systems have been impacted by human activity. And you can use an example of like climate change. Climate has changed in the past, but the sort of climate change Martin outlined to begin with actually are due to human activity. And that's the real difference. We've impacted on it. And it's right what the comrade brought up about the term, because sometimes that is then used to this idea that, well, it's all our fault. It's all of humanity's fault. We're all going to suffer as well, so we've all got to do something. I think sometimes that can actually lead to a real moralism within movements about your own individual activities and choices, but also some right-wing conclusions. Some people actually conclude it's humans' fault, we need to have less people on Earth. I mean, that can take you down very bad ways of looking at it. And I think what Martin brought out is the fact that actually class interests are embedded in this question from the very beginning. From the very beginning, the fact that actually fossil fuels become locked into capitalism is not because of all humanity decides. The capitalist class decides to switch from water power to using coal because they were better able to exploit their workers in towns than having to get their workers to the countryside. The fact that there's a transition to oil is in part driven by the British military's decision to go from coal-powered ships to oil because workers were going on strike in the Welsh coalfields and stopping oil, the coal being there. They made a decision, and once one part of the capitalist class does that, all have to follow suit, and it gets locked in. And you see, the other point is that we talk about this change coming after after the end of the Second World War. It doesn't just happen. It has been locked in. The fossil fuels are locked in from the beginning of industrialisation. But what happens during the Second World War impacts what happens after. So, for example, and this shows actually what the states could do, if you like, what state intervention can do. Massive investment by the US state in oil and chemical industries to help win the Second World War. Massive state-of-the-art factories produced, which are then sold to the companies like DuPont at knockdown prices after. So they get massive capital injections, which then again further lock in not only oil use, but actually paves the way for the future of use of plastic from the chemical industry. And you see, my point about this is that we have to see it in that class way, but also about where does power lie to change it as well. Because, you see, of course, climate change on the surface affects everyone, but actually we know who gets impacted the most are people in some of the poorest countries, or the people like in America, in itself not a poor country, but in Hurricane Katrina, if you were poor, you were the ones that couldn't get out. It does impact in that way. But it's also about where power lies. And I think there is opportunities to build big movements. Trump actually unifies these different issues. But it's also about when you think about these massive corporations, they make their money out of people working there. And what's interesting, INEOS at the moment is actually, based up in Grangemouth, producing more and more plastic from the glut of shale oil coming over from America. But what actually brought INEOS to a standstill a few years ago was when their truck drivers went on strike and stopped oil and petrol and gas from going around. Now, they weren't starting necessarily from thinking about climate change, but they were starting from a different dispute. But actually, in the course of that, they showed the power in society to take on those very big corporations, and our job as socialists is to link those battles together. The mass movements that can be inspired and built around questions of the environment with the power that takes on those corporations, that they have an interest in pursuing this. We have an interest in power to change it and bring about change in that way.
Thank you. There's a lot about reacting to the problems and protesting and movements, but can we also think about prevention? Why do the great powers have such power over majorities who keep voting for right-wing governments, going along with capitalism and powering and fueling it? How can we look at the causes and prevent everyone or the majority wanting to support this system? For instance, if you walk into a garden centre, it's full of pesticides, fungicides, herbicides, fertilisers, power hoses, sprinklers, all kinds of things that we know are really bad for the climate. And yet the people going there think they're really good gardeners and love the planet. So how can we change deep-held opinions rather than simply protesting about the results of them?
Thanks. That's a very good question. But I wanted to say something about technology and climate change. And I suppose geoengineering comes into this to some extent, though I wasn't really going to focus on that. Because the thing is that technology under capitalism exists to make profit, and that's the thing that we have to remember first and foremost. So when we see, everybody has seen the plastic bags being hauled out of Wales, all the programs about, tiny crabs at the bottom of the ocean eating plastic and all the rest of it. So the New Scientist magazine a few weeks ago has a pull-out on biodegradable plastics, all kinds of new technologies that are going to be solve this problem. Except when you actually look at it, you think, well, one, they're not trying to reduce the amount of plastic we're using, but two, again, all these tech companies, which some of them will start out small and will get bought out by Monsanto and Cargill and all these giant corporations, but again, they exist to make profit. They don't exist to save resources, and they don't actually exist to make sure that we're not making stuff purely for the benefit of the corporations. So there was an interview just recently, and I've forgotten where, with a factory worker who works in a plastic factory, and he was making the point that they can make anything. They can retool their machines. They are engineers, they are scientists, they are highly skilled workers. There is nothing they cannot make if they have the ability to choose what they do with it. They can make little plastic stents for the NHS to use to save people's lives from heart attacks. And all that stuff could be made all around the world. Plastic is a useful thing, but if it depends entirely on who controls the process and what purpose it is being made for, and unless ultimately we challenge capitalism, we will endlessly have dead whales and plastic bags.
I just want to come back to the issue of the Anthropocene as well. It's a term that comes from geology, basically, and geologists are still debating it. I find it useful to compare it to the Holocene. So we've been led to believe that we're living in the Holocene, which started about 11,500 years ago. Now, if we believe what people are saying about the Anthropocene, we're now out of that Holocene, and we're into this new epoch, which is defined by human influence. What it literally means is that if a future geologist were to, in the future, were to look at what's been laid down in the sediment during this period that we're living in now, they would find that the majority of what they find in there would be of recent human origins. It would be things like plastic and aluminium and chicken bones, because there's been, there's billions of chickens in the world. Now there's 3 chickens for every person, and that's something that's happened since the Second World War. I agree with Martin that this is really something that's happened since the middle of the 20th century. I think there's a few implications of it. The first one's really quite alarming, actually, because the Holocene, that kind of period of the last 11,500 years, has been an era of relative stability in terms of climate. The Ice Age is finished, and then we had this era where climate and carbon dioxide emissions didn't go up and down too much, and it's been the era in which humans have been able to develop as a species and to go on to live in cities and develop agriculture. All of that has developed in that we're in the Holocene, really. So now they're saying that we've gone into this new epoch, which is quite unpredictable and quite scary, and we don't really know what's going to happen in this new epoch that we're already in as well. And I think the other implication of it is that we need to stop saying, really, that we need to stop thinking about environmentalism as just about what happens in the wilderness or just about what happens out in the countryside away from cities. I think it really highlights how much human influence there is on the rest of the natural world. We've always been part of nature, but now our influence is so big that it's global. So we need to start thinking about, the environment is also something to do with social relations and how humans are organised, and it's also to do with what happens in cities and how people are organised in cities and what kind of transport we use. It's not just about the wilderness and the outdoors and things.
And I think it's also connected to your next subject. Camilla will be talking in this room about whether science is political, and I think this issue does prove it actually is. We've always been used to science being political. It has been always true for the alpha sciences, but it has increasingly become true for studies like biology and geology. I'm a geologist, so the Anthropocene is an epoch, but it's a bit the other way around, because geologists tend to discern an epoch when it's represented in deposits in a particular way. And here we anticipate deposits of a particularly cataclysmic nature, I must say. I would think that the hurricane like Katrina would be represented technically in, let's say, the Mississippi Delta or wherever. What is important is when you look at the past 2.5 million years, which is my specialization, this is a period they call the Ice Ages, which is basically you have like 24 glacial cycles changing the world from colder to warmer. But actually, altogether, it's a very stable situation, this interchanging of warm and cold. And it has come into being because of particular geological reasons, which is, amongst others, the formation of an ice cap on Antarctica and the formation of sea current and air currents comprising altogether a more or less stable and buffering system. My teacher told me like 20 years ago, we're heading towards an ice age. Now this is where it becomes interesting, because obviously we're not. The world becomes hotter in an interglacial cycle. That means, Martin was talking, I'll try to be quick on this. Martin talked about we are in the 6th wave of extinction. Yeah, we've had former extinctions, like at the end of the Silurian, the Permian, and Cretaceous. And the interesting and important thing about these periods of extinction is we realize, one, we're connected. It was not one single species, but it was a whole chain and chains of species that got wiped out completely off the face of the earth. It was not only like the Brontosaur, but the T-Rex went with it. And the cruelty of the situation was that there were one cellular organism in the sea, diatoms. They were able to go into a sleepy state for years, and they were able to survive. And evolution created new spaces. And in this case, the space was for mammals. In this wave of extinction, nothing bigger than a big rat survived, because we are dependent upon the rest of nature. This is the core of what we have to make clear to potential allies in the debate with the climate deniers. The cruelty and the scale of the onslaught that is waiting us will not be emphasized by the people denying anything is the case. The Anthropocene is useful. The technical terms, the technical limitations of it are not so important. The message is we do change climate, and we're doing it in a very, very hazardous way, and we need action now.
Thanks, comrades. As always, there's far too much to talk about, isn't there? And we never have enough time. Firstly, thanks to Pete for correcting me on the question of biofuels and DRACs. I certainly didn't want to give the impression that I felt that they were an improvement in any way, and I think Pete's right to emphasise that. What I was, I suppose, trying to get across is the sense that for the owners of DRACs, for the government, for all sorts of corporations, they're trying to portray the transition from coal to biofuels as a positive thing for the environment. It's absolutely not, and thanks to Pete for highlighting that. A number of questions around the Anthropocene. Firstly, if you haven't read them already, I would recommend you read Camilla, who spoke a little bit ago. She wrote a very good article in the ISJ about the Anthropocene and some of the debates in Marxism amongst it. It's a great article. It's a good opportunity to learn about this topic, and I'd highly recommend it. I'd also highly recommend Ian Angus's book, Facing the Anthropocene. Ian spoke at Marxism last year, and there's two copies of it on sale for sale there. Firstly, what is the Anthropocene? Because someone asked, I wasn't clear enough. Well, the Anthropocene is a geological term. It's a scientific term. It's not a political term. It's a scientific term from the scientific community for the epoch of human history that you may have heard. You know, the dinosaurs lived in the Jurassic. It's that sort of term for the period when geologically the changes that are taking place in the records, in the geological records, are those caused by human activity. later in the creation of plastics, chicken bones, and the restaurant. You can imagine sort of far-flung future time when aliens come and visit the Earth, they dig down and they'll say, oh, something happened in that period, and that's really what the Anthropocene represents. And the term anthro represents the idea that humans are the issue. It's the era of the human, if you like, the epoch of the human. And I understand Comrade saying, and you know, there's a lot of debate in the books, and Ian in particular takes up some of this in his book, about should it really be called the Capitalocene, because it is capitalism that's doing this. Well, the problem is firstly, the Marxist left can't necessarily tell the scientific community what language to use, and the term has come out of debates and discussions inside their community. Secondly, I think that that itself causes problems, because if you had a Capitalocene, are you also going to have, I don't know, a Feudalocene and a Hunter-Gatherocene and so on? But also, I think it can also undermine a sense that actually what this is the scientific community recognising that something is taking place and changing it, and it can dismiss the sense that actually the authors of all those papers actually understand that there's an unequal impact, that they understand that it's not about all humans, that it's about the way that society is structured. And if you read the papers, I was trying to find the quote, unfortunately I wasn't able to find it, but a whole number of them do talk about the way it's the 1% doing the way that society is geared towards their interest, and it's not the majority of the population. I think this is a term that has been given to us, and we have to, I think, work in it and use it in that sense. But that's not to dismiss the very real question of inequality. Here's a quote from Frederick Engels's book, The Condition of the Working Class in England. He writes about how the rich lived on the outskirts of Manchester and drove in their carriages. The money aristocracy can take the shortest road through the middle of all the labouring districts to their places of business without ever seeing that they are in the midst of grimy misery that lurks to the right and to the left. And what I think he captures there is a sense of how the rich are living in an isolation of all the environmental impacts of the world that is organised in their interest. There's no billionaires who drowned in the Middle East, in the Mediterranean. There's no billionaires worried about losing their homes and living in camper vans in Katrina, because the impact of climate change is caused by the way society is structured, and it impacts unequally. And this brings me to respond to one of the questions that a comrade asked of how do we make people aware? Well, and how do we sort of change people's consciousness? Well, actually, I think in some senses that's already happening, irrespective, because of the way society is, forces people to realise and understand that these things are happening. One of the reasons Blue Planet is so popular is, I think, because ordinary working people love to know what's happening to the world and are really scared about it. Or why do people go and buy those little things to try and have insects and bees in their garden? Because actually they understand there's a problem with bees and insects and would like to try and help. The problem is they have very little space to make a real difference. But I think this striking thing about society is how many ordinary working people do care and do want to be involved. The problem is that society tells us that they're going to do it as for us. These clever scientists, these big businessmen, these politicians, they're going to solve the problem for us. You just need to buy the little home for your bees and not use pesticides and organic and cycle to work and not the rest of it. And so people are demobilised and disenfranchised from dealing with the question. And our job, I think, is to try and encourage that actually you need to be participating in actual campaigns, which is why it's so interesting that when fracking does take place, what happens is that working class people, communities actually start to get involved, and they start sometimes because fracking is going to make their house price collapse. Sometimes they start getting involved because they don't want their kids to have to walk to school past hundreds and hundreds of lorries going back and forth to the site. But as they're involved in that struggle, they start to actually all sorts of other questions up. Climate change. I remember we first went to Barton Moss. People said to us, don't talk about climate change. It's not about climate change. It's about where my kids go to school. A few weeks later, they're all talking about, my God, have you seen what's going on in the planet? Not because they don't care about that, because actually the struggles start to widen horizons and raise it. And I'm sure that's true of all sorts of other aspects to it. And I think it's interesting that this debate, I thought this debate was going to be, you should do this in the climate movement, the SWP should do that. Actually, I think it's interesting that it's focused on the questions of jobs, really, because I think what that represents is people trying to think, how do we start to structure movements that can make real differences? And the Heathrow question is really interesting. If you read the press release that the Board of Management of Heathrow released the day after the vote in Parliament, it's a real celebratory press release. 50 years we've had this debate, and now finally we can move forward. And within 12 months we're going to create 900 jobs. Wow. 900 jobs, wow. And then some point in the future there's going to be 40,000 jobs. And actually what the press release says is all the investment that's going to go to local communities, how there's only going to be 6.5 hours at night where there's no flights, and isn't that great? That's, it could be a lot worse. 6.5, we need a lot more than 6.5 hours sleep, comrades. But the fascinating thing is what it doesn't talk about is how much money they're going to make out of it, because that's really what they're celebrating, how much the profits that are going to ooze in from all those rich people flying into, and it is predominantly rich people flying into Heathrow. And in this context, though, how do we respond? You see, I think that there's a danger that you simply say, fuck you, Len McCluskey, why did you let us bloody Labour? I think what we have to do is create a political strategy that says we can offer concrete alternatives. We can offer more jobs sooner. And really the debate is not really about Heathrow. The debate is whether or not a state can drive through and create jobs. That's a real discussion. I think a whole section of the Labour movement and the trade union movement don't believe that the government can create jobs anymore. So they're looking to the shortcuts, the free market, big business to do it for them. We have to say it's entirely possible for a Labour government or a future government to create jobs in large numbers that can actually not destroy the environment like this, can actually be healthy, sustainable, well paid, and all the other things that comrades have talked about. And that is why years ago we helped launch the 1 million climate jobs strategy. It wasn't a trick to get trade unions to talk about climate change. It's because actually we want a working class strategy, an alternative that says let's have more public transport, more trains, cleaner, better ways of building houses and so on, not limited options based on what big business wants in Heathrow or Drax or all these other places. And I think that's what, someone asked, how would we operate if we were mines? Well, I think what we'd do is we go to miners and say, isn't it mad that you have to work under the ground 12 hours a day? Isn't there a better way of organising society? Look at all this free sunshine, look at all this free, let's build those and let's retask, retool, re-energise, retrain people to take up those tasks. And that's partly what I think we do inside the climate movement, is to try and have those options and to try and have the positive alternatives, not dismiss people. When it comes to reality, fracking will create very, very few jobs. If you want to create jobs up in the northwest or the northeast of England, actually let's have renewable energy, let's have public transport. That will create many, many more jobs and people won't have to breathe the atmosphere of it. Lovely to spend a long time talking about how socialist societies would be environmentally and sustainable friendly. And I don't have time. Partly I think that one thing we can point to is that what we would do is we invest resources, humans and financial, into industries and strategies for that would be environmentally better. I think the other thing, though, is what we do is we'd strive constantly to try and make society think about the natural world as part of a key component of what we do every day of our lives. You can imagine a socialist society where people sit down and they don't just think, what would be the impact of building that house there on, I don't know, the local population or rest of it. They think, what it will do to the water table? What would that mean to traffic? All those sort of questions would become very, very real for people, because they're starting from a point is not how do we make money, but from a vision of how society works and how our place is in nature. And I think that's really what we're fighting for. And I think part of the strategy that socialists have to have as we fight to get to that future is to encourage and inject into our movements a sense that the environment is part of it, but it's also being destroyed by capitalism, and we need our broadest movements to take up all those wider questions as part of what we're doing. System change, not climate change. Thank you.